Oh, Sarah, you're being so dramatic. Michael's kids really wanted to go to the amusement park, and we'd already promised them. My mother's voice on the phone was casual, almost bored, like she was explaining why she'd chosen one brand of cereal over another at the grocery store. Not like she was explaining why she'd missed her only granddaughter's 7th birthday party. Not like she was dismissing 3 hours of Emma asking every 10 minutes when Grandma and Grandpa would arrive, her little face pressed against the living room window, watching for their car. I'm Sarah Mitchell, 32 years old, single mother to the most incredible 7-year-old girl in the world, and I've spent the last 3 years paying my parents $700 every single week. I did the math once during a sleepless night about 6 months ago, lying in bed staring at the ceiling of our small 2-bedroom apartment in Sacramento, listening to Emma's soft breathing from her room across the hall. $109,200. That's what I'd given them since Emma was 4, since I desperately needed help with childcare while working full-time as a medical billing specialist at Delta Regional Medical Center. $700 every Friday, transferred without fail from my checking account to theirs, in exchange for their promise to help with Emma, to be there for her, to be the grandparent she deserved. I work 45 hours a week minimum, sometimes 50 when we're behind on claims processing, and every dollar counts when you're raising a child alone. Emma's father left when I was 5 months pregnant, decided fatherhood wasn't for him after all, moved to Portland with a girl he'd known for 3 weeks, and I haven't heard from him since except for the child support payments that arrive irregularly, sometimes 2 months late, sometimes not at all. My parents knew this. They knew how hard I was working, how much I was struggling, how desperately I needed support. They'd promised to be that support. But they'd missed Emma's birthday party because my brother Michael's kids wanted to go to Six Flags. Michael, who's 35, who has a wife with a steady income, who makes $70,000 a year as an operations manager compared to my $42,000, who has never needed to ask our parents for help because everything has always just worked out for Michael. Golden child Michael, who could do no wrong, who got the college fund while I got student loans, who got the down payment help for his house while I scraped together first and last month's rent. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, looking at the remains of Emma's party, the half-eaten cake from Sweet Dreams Bakery that cost me $85, the deflated balloons, the untouched gift I'd wrapped from Grandma and Grandpa because I'd been so sure they'd come this time, and I felt something crack inside my chest. The arrangement started 3 years ago in September, when Emma was starting pre-K and I was drowning under the weight of childcare costs that were eating up nearly half my paycheck. I remember sitting at my parents' kitchen table, the same oak table where I'd done my homework as a kid, spreading out my budget on paper to show them how impossible the math had become. $750 a month for after-school care, plus another $300 for the extended hours I sometimes needed when claims processing backed up at the hospital. My mother had reached across the table and squeezed my hand, and my father had nodded with what looked like genuine concern, and they'd said the words I desperately needed to hear. "We'll help with Emma. You pay us what you can afford, and we'll make sure she's taken care of. She's our granddaughter. Family takes care of family." We'd settled on $700 a week because that's what I could manage, barely, by cutting back on everything else, by buying generic everything, by giving up the small luxuries that made life bearable. They'd promised to pick Emma up from school 3 days a week, to keep her on Fridays when I worked late, to be available for the inevitable sick days and school holidays that don't align with work schedules. For the first few months, they'd kept that promise. My mother had picked Emma up, had sent me photos of them baking cookies together, had brought her to my apartment, fed and happy and chattering about her day with Grandma. Then Michael's wife Jennifer had their second child, a boy they named Mason, and something shifted. The first time they canceled on me, it was because Jennifer needed help with the baby and her older son Tyler, who was 3 at the time. I understood. New babies are exhausting. I rearranged my schedule, took a personal day I couldn't afford, told myself it was temporary. But it kept happening. They'd confirm they could take Emma. I'd plan my week around their availability. And then the day before, or sometimes the morning of, I'd get a text. Jennifer needs us today. Can you find other arrangements? I started keeping track without really meaning to, just noting in my phone's calendar when they'd canceled, and a pattern emerged that made my stomach hurt. They never missed Tyler's preschool graduation, but they'd skipped Emma's end-of-year program because it conflicted with Tyler's swimming lesson. They'd driven 2 hours to watch Tyler in a church Christmas pageant where he played a sheep and had no lines, but they'd been too tired to come to Emma's dance recital that was 15 minutes from their house. When Mason turned 1, they'd thrown a party that must have cost thousands, with a custom cake and a bounce house and a petting zoo, and they'd posted dozens of photos on Facebook. When Emma turned 6, they'd stopped by for 20 minutes, handed her a card with a $50 bill inside, and left to babysit Michael's kids so he and Jennifer could go to dinner. I kept paying them $700 every single week, kept transferring the money like clockwork every Friday morning, because I told myself they were still helping. They were still there when I absolutely needed them in emergencies. And because some broken part of me hoped that if I just kept being the good daughter, the reliable one, the one who paid her debts, they'd eventually see me the way they saw Michael. They'd eventually show up for Emma the way they showed up for Tyler and Mason without anyone having to beg. Last year alone, I could count 17 specific instances where my parents had chosen Michael's children over Emma. And I knew the number was 17 exactly because I'd started keeping detailed records without really intending to create evidence, just trying to make sense of the pattern that was breaking my daughter's heart piece by piece. In March, they'd missed Emma's school play where she'd had 3 whole lines as a singing flower, a role she'd practiced for weeks, because Tyler had a basketball game, his first of the season, and my mother had texted me a photo of them in the stands, holding a sign that said, "Go Tyler," with glitter and paint that must have taken an hour to make. In May, they'd promised to come to Emma's dance recital, her first time performing the solo she'd worked so hard to learn, and they'd canceled the morning of because Mason had a cold and Jennifer needed help, even though Michael had the day off work and was perfectly capable of parenting his own sick child. They'd forgotten Emma's actual 7th birthday in August, didn't call, didn't send a card, nothing, and when I'd finally called them 3 days later, my mother had been flustered and apologetic in that vague way that meant she genuinely hadn't remembered, and then she'd mentioned in the same breath that they'd just gotten back from taking Tyler and Mason to the zoo for a special grandparents' day. I had bank statements going back 3 years in a folder in my desk drawer, every single $700 transfer highlighted in yellow, 156 weeks of payments that I'd made, even when it meant I couldn't fix my car's broken air conditioning through an entire Sacramento summer, even when it meant Emma and I ate rice and beans for dinner 4 nights a week, even when it meant I put off going to the dentist for a cracked filling because I couldn't afford the copay. I had text message screenshots in a folder on my phone, conversations where they'd confirmed they'd be available for Emma and then canceled, always for something related to Michael's family, always with that casual assumption that I'd understand, that I'd simply handle it, that my needs and Emma's needs were infinitely flexible while Michael's were set in stone. Emma had started noticing about 6 months ago, had asked me with the devastating clarity that children sometimes possess why Grandma and Grandpa loved Tyler and Mason more than they loved her, and I'd choked on my own answer, had tried to explain that they loved her just as much. They were just very busy, knowing even as I said it, that I was lying to protect people who didn't deserve protection. My best friend Lisa had been there for that conversation, had been over helping me hem the curtains in Emma's bedroom, and after Emma had gone to play in her room, Lisa had looked at me with fury in her eyes and said, "Sarah, you need to stop making excuses for them. You need to stop paying them to neglect your daughter. You need to stand up and tell them this isn't okay." But I'd deflected, had changed the subject, had clung to the hope that maybe next time would be different. Maybe they'd finally show up. Maybe I just needed to be patient and understanding, and eventually they'd see what they were doing. I planned Emma's 8th birthday party 3 months in advance, marking it on my calendar in red ink and sending my parents a text in early September, asking them to save the date for December 7th. a Saturday afternoon that would give Emma the celebration she deserved after a year of being overlooked and forgotten. They'd responded immediately with enthusiasm, my mother texting back, "Wouldn't miss it for the world. Emma is going to be so excited." And my father adding a thumbs up emoji, which for him was practically an effusive display of commitment. I asked them 2 more times as the date approached, once in October when I booked the party venue at Roseville's indoor play center, and again in November when I finalized the head count and needed to confirm how many adults would be attending, and both times they assured me they'd be there. They were looking forward to it. Emma was their granddaughter, and of course they'd come celebrate with her. I spent $875 on that party, money I'd saved by taking on extra weekend shifts processing insurance claims, money that could have gone toward the new winter coat Emma needed, or the laptop that was barely limping along, or the million other things we did without, so I could give my daughter one perfect day. I rented the venue for 3 hours, ordered a custom cake decorated with unicorns and rainbows because Emma had been obsessed with both since she was 5, hired a face painter and a balloon artist, bought decorations and party favors and a new dress for Emma that made her spin in circles in the dressing room mirror. She'd been talking about the party for weeks, had made handmade invitations for her school friends, had asked me every few days if Grandma and Grandpa had said anything about what present they might bring her, and each time she asked I felt something twist in my chest, because I knew, somewhere deep down I knew, that I was setting her up for disappointment, even as I desperately hoped this time would be different. The morning of the party, I was in the kitchen making sandwiches to take to the venue. Emma was in her new dress, twirling around the living room, practicing her surprised face for when we brought out the cake, and my phone buzzed with a text from my mother at 9:30, 2.5 hours before the party was supposed to start. "Hi, honey. Something came up. Michael's kids really wanted to go to Six Flags today and we promised we'd take them. Hope Emma has a wonderful birthday. We'll drop off her present next week." I read the message 3 times, standing at the counter with the butter knife still in my hand, mayonnaise smearing onto my fingers, and I felt something crack open in my chest that had been developing hairline fractures for years. Not an emergency, not a family crisis or a health issue or anything that actually required them to cancel. Michael's kids wanted to go to an amusement park, and that casual weekend entertainment preference, was more important than the birthday party I'd planned for 3 months, had confirmed with them repeatedly, had spent nearly $900 on because I wanted Emma to feel special and loved and celebrated. I walked into the living room where Emma was still spinning in her new dress, and I had to tell her that Grandma and Grandpa weren't coming after all. Had to watch her face fall, and her eyes fill with tears she tried to blink back, had to hear her ask in a small voice, "Did I do something wrong?" and feel my heart shatter into pieces I didn't know how I'd ever put back together. I made it through Emma's party on autopilot, smiling for the photographs and singing happy birthday and cutting the unicorn cake into perfect slices, while something cold and hard crystallized in my chest where my heart used to be. And when Lisa pulled me aside near the end while Emma was playing with her friends and asked quietly, "Are you okay?" I felt the tears I'd been holding back for 3 hours finally spill over, and I whispered, "No, I'm really not. I can't keep doing this to her. I can't keep letting them hurt her." And Lisa gripped my shoulders and looked me straight in the eye and said, "Then don't, Sarah. Stop protecting people who don't protect you. Stop making excuses for them. Go over there tomorrow and tell them exactly what they've done and what it's cost you." That night, after Emma fell asleep still wearing her party dress because she hadn't wanted to take it off, I sat at my kitchen table and opened my laptop and pulled out the folder with all the bank statements I'd been keeping, and I went through every single one, highlighting each $700 transfer, writing the dates in a notebook, calculating the total with a growing sense of sick disbelief that I'd let this go on for so long. 156 weeks. 3 years exactly. $700 multiplied by 156 equaled $109,200. I stared at that number until my vision blurred, thinking about what that money could have meant for Emma and me, the security it could have provided, the opportunities it could have opened, the stress it could have relieved, And all of it had gone to parents who couldn't even show up for a birthday party they'd confirmed 3 separate times. I opened the folder on my phone with the text message screenshots, scrolling through months of conversations where they'd promised to be there and then canceled, where they'd sent photos of themselves with Tyler and Mason doing special activities on the same days they'd missed Emma's important moments, where they'd casually mentioned taking Michael's family to dinner, or the movies, or the beach, while Emma and I ate rice and beans and hoped the car wouldn't break down. I printed everything, the bank statements, and the text messages, and a handwritten list of every event they'd missed in the past year with the reason why. And I put it all in a manila folder that felt like it weighed 10 pounds, even though it was just paper, just evidence of what I'd known in my heart but had been too afraid to confront. I barely slept that night, lying awake thinking about every time in my childhood when Michael had gotten the bigger slice of cake, or the nicer birthday present, or the louder praise. Every time my accomplishments had been met with mild approval while his had been celebrated like national achievements. Every time I'd been told to be quieter, less demanding, more understanding, because Michael needed attention or support or space. This wasn't new. The favoritism had always been there, woven into the fabric of my family from the beginning, and I'd spent 32 years trying to earn equal treatment through perfect behavior and endless accommodation and financial generosity that cost me everything while changing nothing. The next morning, I called Lisa and asked if she could watch Emma for a few hours. And when she arrived at my apartment and saw the folder on the counter and the determination on my face, she hugged me hard and said, "It's about damn time. Make them hear you. Don't back down." And I drove to my parents' house in Folsom with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, but my resolve solid as steel because I wasn't doing this for me anymore. I was doing this for Emma. For the little girl who'd asked if she'd done something wrong when her grandparents had chosen an amusement park over her 8th birthday. I arrived at my parents' house at 10:30 on Sunday morning, parking in the driveway behind my father's Silverado and sitting for a moment with the manila folder clutched in my hands, rehearsing what I wanted to say and trying to steady my breathing before I walked up to the front door and rang the bell, even though I'd grown up here and had always just walked in before. But this felt different, formal, like I was drawing a line between the daughter who'd accepted everything and the woman who was demanding answers. My mother opened the door in her bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, and her expression flickered with surprise before settling into something that looked almost annoyed, and she said, "Sarah, what are you doing here? You should have called first. Your father and I were just sitting down to watch our Sunday programs." And I felt the old instinct to apologize and leave rising up before I pushed it down and said, "We need to talk about yesterday, about Emma's party," and walked past her into the living room where my father was settled in his recliner with the television on, some home renovation show playing at a volume that suggested he was half asleep. He glanced up when I entered, but didn't move, didn't sit up straighter or mute the television, or show any indication that my unexpected visit warranted his full attention, and my mother followed me into the room saying, "Oh honey, we explained that. Michael's boys really wanted to go to Six Flags, and we'd been planning it for a while," which was a lie because she'd confirmed Emma's party as recently as 3 weeks ago, and I stood in the middle of their living room holding my folder and said as calmly as I could manage, "You confirmed Emma's party 3 separate times over 3 months, Mom. You told me you wouldn't miss it for the world, and then you canceled 2 hours before it started because Tyler and Mason wanted to go to an amusement park." My mother waved her hand dismissively and sat down on the couch, setting her coffee on the side table, and said, "You're being dramatic, Sarah. Kids are resilient. Emma probably didn't even notice we weren't there with all her little friends around." And something hot flared in my chest because Emma had absolutely noticed, had cried and asked if she'd done something wrong, but I kept my voice level and said, "This isn't just about yesterday. This is about a pattern that's been going on for years. You've missed Emma's school play, her dance recital, her actual birthday in September, and every single time it's because you were doing something with Michael's kids instead." My father finally reached for the remote and muted the television, And my mother's expression shifted from dismissive to defensive as she said, "Michael needs more help than you do, Sarah. He has 2 children, and Jennifer works full-time, and they have a lot of demands on them. You only have Emma, and your schedule is more flexible." And I almost laughed at the absurdity of that justification, because Michael made $85,000 a year as an IT manager, and Jennifer made $60,000 as a dental hygienist, while I scraped by on $42,000 doing medical billing. But I said, "More flexible? Mom, I work full-time and raise Emma alone, and I've been paying you $700 a week for 3 years for help you've barely provided." The silence that followed my statement was absolute, broken only by the sound of a car passing on the street outside, and then my father's recliner creaked as he sat up straighter and said, $700 a week? In a tone that suggested he'd genuinely never done the math. And I opened the manila folder with hands that were no longer shaking and pulled out the bank statements, walking over to the coffee table and spreading them across the surface in a fan of damning evidence. 3 years of highlighted transfers that told a story my parents clearly hadn't been paying attention to. My mother leaned forward to look at them, and my father actually stood up from his chair and came closer, and I said, $700 a week for 156 weeks, which equals $109,200. Mom and Dad, that's what I've paid you since Emma was 5 years old. That's what I've given you in exchange for your promise to help me with childcare and to be present in her life. And I watched the color drain from my mother's face as she picked up one of the statements and traced her finger down the column of transfers. My father said, "We didn't ask you to pay us that much, Sarah. You insisted on contributing because you didn't want charity." Which was technically true, but completely missed the point. And I said, "I paid you that much because you told me it was necessary. You said you were giving up other opportunities to help me. You made me feel like I owed you for being Emma's grandparents. And I've scraped by for 3 years barely making rent while you took that money and clearly didn't prioritize the commitment you promised." My mother's defensiveness returned, and she dropped the bank statement back on the table and said, "We did help with Emma when you needed it. We picked her up from school dozens of times. We watched her on evenings when you had to work late. You can't say we did nothing." And she was right that they'd helped sometimes, but wrong about the scale of it. And I pulled out the second set of papers from my folder, the calendar I'd printed showing the past year with color-coded markings for every event Emma had, every time they'd confirmed attendance, every time they'd canceled, and every social media post they'd made showing what they'd been doing instead. My father looked at the calendar and something shifted in his expression, some flicker of discomfort, or maybe recognition, and I said, "You picked Emma up from school maybe once a month, Dad, and usually only when it was convenient for you, when you were already in Sacramento for something else. But you drive to Roseville 3 times a week to take Tyler to soccer practice and Mason to tutoring." And my mother started to interrupt, but I kept going because I'd spent 3 years being quiet, and I was done. "Michael makes $85,000 a year. Jennifer makes $60,000. They have 2 incomes and financial stability, and you still give them your time and attention. And from what I've heard from Aunt Caroline, you give them money too. While I make $42,000 raising a daughter alone and paying you $700 a week for help, I rarely actually received." My mother's face flushed red and she said, "Your brother has a family to support. He has responsibilities. And yes, we help him sometimes because that's what parents do." And I said, "I have a family to support too, Mom. I have a daughter who needed you to show up yesterday, and you chose his children over her again, just like you've chosen him over me my entire life." The words hung in the air between us, and I watched my mother's face transform from defensive indignation to something harder and more cutting. And she stood up from the couch with her hands clenched at her sides and said, "You chose to be a single mother, Sarah. You chose to get involved with a man who left you pregnant and alone. Those were your decisions, and we've helped you deal with the consequences, even though we didn't approve of your choices." And the cruelty of that statement hit me like a physical blow, because Emma wasn't a consequence. She was a beautiful 7-year-old girl who deserved grandparents who loved her, and I felt tears burning in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall because I'd cried enough over my parents' rejection, and I was done giving them that power over me. My father remained silent in that moment, and his silence felt like agreement, like complicity in my mother's assessment of my life. And I thought about all the times throughout my childhood when he'd stood by quietly while my mother praised Michael's accomplishments and glossed over mine, when she'd gone to every single one of his football games but missed my academic award ceremonies because they conflicted with her book club or her volunteering schedule, when she'd thrown him an elaborate high school graduation party with 100 guests and given me a small family dinner because girls don't need as much fuss. I realized standing in their living room with my evidence spread across their coffee table that this pattern didn't start when Emma was born or even when I got pregnant. It had been there my entire life, woven into the fabric of our family dynamics so thoroughly that I'd accepted it as normal, had internalized the message that Michael mattered more and I should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention came my way. But something had shifted in me over the past 24 hours, watching Emma's face crumple when I told her Grandma and Grandpa weren't coming to her party. Something fundamental had broken and reformed into something stronger, and I looked at my mother and said with a steadiness that surprised me, "Emma isn't a consequence, Mom. She's my daughter and your granddaughter, and she deserves the same love and attention you give Tyler and Mason without question. And if you can't see that, then this isn't about my choices, it's about yours." My mother started to respond, but I kept talking because I needed to say this, needed to finally put into words what I'd felt for 32 years. And I said, "I've spent my whole life trying to earn your approval, trying to be good enough to deserve the same pride you've always had in Michael. And I've made myself small and accommodating and grateful for whatever attention you'd give me. But I'm done with that now because Emma is watching and learning, and I will not teach her that she should accept being treated as less than." My father finally spoke and said, "Sarah, you're being unfair. We love you and Emma." But his words sounded hollow and automatic, and I said, "Then show it, Dad, because love isn't just words, it's actions and time, and showing up when you say you will, and you haven't done that for us." And I gathered up my bank statements and my calendar and put them back in the manila folder because they'd seen the evidence, and either they'd choose to acknowledge it or they wouldn't. I looked at both of them standing in their comfortable living room in their comfortable lives where they'd never had to question whether they were loved or valued, and I said, "The payments stop today. I won't be sending you any more money. And until you can treat Emma with the same priority you treat Michael's children, I need distance from you." And my mother's expression shifted to shock as she said, "You don't mean that?" I meant every word, and my voice didn't waver when I said, "I absolutely mean it, and here are my terms. You treat Emma exactly the same way you treat Tyler and Mason. You show up for her events the way you show up for theirs. You give her the same time and attention and priority, or you don't have a relationship with either of us. And those are the only options I'm offering." My mother let out a sound that was half laugh and half scoff and said, "Sarah, you're being ridiculous. You'll calm down in a few days and realize you're overreacting. You always come around eventually." And the dismissiveness in her tone made something harden in my chest because she was right that I'd always backed down before, had always swallowed my hurt and accepted whatever crumbs of affection they offered. But she was wrong if she thought that pattern would continue. I said, "I'm not overreacting and I'm not going to calm down and change my mind. I'm setting a boundary that should have existed years ago, nay. And furthermore, I want you to repay at least a portion of the money I've given you, since you clearly didn't hold up your end of our arrangement." And my father's face flushed dark red as he said, "You want us to pay you back? For helping with your own daughter? That's what this is about. Money?" I felt my temper flare, but kept my voice level when I said, "This is about $109,000 I paid you in good faith for help and support you promised and rarely delivered, Dad. This is about you taking my money every single week while prioritizing Michael's family over mine, and yes, I think you owe me at least partial repayment." My mother stood up straighter and said, "We don't owe you anything. We're your parents, and we've given you plenty over the years. And if you can't appreciate that, then maybe you do need some distance to gain perspective. And I was opening my mouth to respond when I heard the front door open, and Michael's voice called out, "Mom, your text said it was urgent. What's going on?" My brother walked into the living room and took in the scene, me standing with my manila folder and my parents looking angry and defensive. And my mother said, "Your sister is having some kind of breakdown. She's accusing us of favoritism and demanding we pay her back money she insisted on giving us." And I watched Michael's expression shift to that familiar condescending concern he'd always used with me, the look that said he thought I was being emotional and irrational. He said, "Sarah, what's this about? Mom said you were upset about Emma's party, but I'm sure they had a good reason for missing it." And I turned to face him and said, "They took your kids to an amusement park instead, Michael. They chose Tyler and Mason over Emma on her birthday after confirming multiple times they'd be there. And it's not the first time. It's a pattern that's been going on for years." Michael glanced at our parents and then back at me and said, "I'm sure it's not as one-sided as you're making it sound. Mom and Dad help you all the time. They're always talking about picking Emma up or watching her." And the casual way he dismissed my experience made me realize he'd probably never noticed the favoritism because he'd benefited from it his entire life. Had lived at the center of our parents' attention for so long that he thought it was normal and didn't see how different my experience had been. I said, "They pick Emma up maybe once a month, Michael, while they're at your house 3 times a week helping with your kids, and I've been paying them $700 a week for 3 years, while you make almost twice what I make and still receive their time, and according to Aunt Caroline, their money too." And he bristled at that and said, "What I receive from our parents is none of your business, Sarah. And maybe if you weren't so proud, you'd accept help more gracefully instead of turning everything into a transaction." His words hit something final in me, and I looked at my brother standing there in our parents' living room, defending a system that had always benefited him while being completely blind to how it had hurt me. And I realized there was nothing more to say because they couldn't see what they refused to see. And I said quietly, "I'm not the one who made this a transaction, Michael. They did when they accepted $700 a week from me and then consistently chose your family over mine, and I'm done explaining myself to people who don't want to understand." And I walked toward the door, clutching my manila folder while my mother called after me, "Sarah, don't you dare walk out of this house. We're not finished discussing this." But we were finished because I'd said everything I needed to say, and staying would only mean more circular arguments and more pain. So I kept walking and heard my father say, "Let her go, she needs to cool off," as if my carefully documented grievances were just a temper tantrum that would pass. I drove home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel and tears finally streaming down my face now that I was alone, and I felt this strange mixture of relief and grief because I'd finally stood up for myself and Emma, but it meant accepting that my parents might never give us what we deserved. When I walked into my apartment, Lisa was there with Emma watching a movie and eating popcorn, and Lisa took one look at my face and said, "I'll stay with Emma. Go decompress." So I went to my bedroom and lay on my bed and cried harder than I had in years, mourning not just the relationship I had with my parents, but the relationship I'd always wanted and would probably never have. The next few days were strange because I kept expecting to feel guilty or to want to apologize and make peace the way I always had before, but instead, I felt lighter, like I'd put down a weight I'd been carrying for 3 decades. My parents started texting on the second day, and the messages followed a predictable pattern. My mother's first text said, "I hope you've calmed down and are ready to discuss this rationally," which I didn't respond to, followed by my father's, "You're being unfair to your mother, she's very upset," which also got no response. And then over the next week, the texts escalated to angry messages about my ingratitude, and then finally to pleading messages about how family should stick together. On the 6th day, I blocked both their numbers because I needed space to think clearly without their attempts to pull me back into old patterns, and I focused my energy on Emma, who'd ask careful questions about why we weren't seeing Grandma and Grandpa. I sat down with her one evening and said in age-appropriate terms, Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements and need time apart to think about things, and Grandma and Grandpa and I are having one of those times. And Emma looked at me with her serious dark eyes and said something that broke my heart. They don't seem to like us very much anyway, Mommy. They're always busy when we want to see them, but they're never too busy for Tyler and Mason. Her perception was so clear and honest that I felt tears prick my eyes, and I pulled her close and said, "That's not about you, sweetheart. That's about choices they're making, and you are wonderful and lovable and deserving of grandparents who show up for you." And she hugged me tight and said, "We're okay, just us, Mommy." Lisa came over almost every evening that week, bringing dinner or just sitting with me while Emma played, and she said, "I'm proud of you for holding your boundary. I know this is hard." And I admitted, part of me keeps waiting to cave, to call them and apologize and go back to normal. And she said firmly, "Normal was them treating you terribly while you paid them a fortune. You don't want to go back to that." On the 8th day, my coworker Janet mentioned during lunch that her friend was a family law attorney who sometimes handled disputes over informal financial agreements, and she said carefully, "I don't know if you're interested, but she does free consultations, just in case you want to explore your options about the money." And I took the business card she offered, even though I wasn't sure I'd use it. 2 weeks after I'd blocked my parents' numbers, my phone rang with a call from my Aunt Caroline, my father's younger sister who I'd always liked but didn't see often. And when I answered, she said, "Sarah, honey, I heard about what happened with your parents, and I wanted you to know that I see it. I've always seen how differently they treat you and Michael." And her validation after so many years of silence from extended family made my throat tight with emotion. She said she'd had coffee with my mother the previous week, and my mother had painted me as unreasonable and dramatic. But Caroline had asked pointed questions and gotten enough information to piece together the real story. And she told me, "I should have said something years ago. I'm sorry I didn't. But I watched them do the same thing to me that they're doing to you, always prioritizing your Uncle David because he was the son and I was just the daughter. And it took me until I was 40 to realize I didn't need their approval to have worth." We talked for nearly an hour, and she shared stories I'd never heard about my father learning the favoritism from his own parents, about how my grandmother had doted on him while barely acknowledging Caroline's achievements. And I started to see the generational pattern that had shaped my family's dynamics for decades. Over the next few days, more family members reached out, and I realized that Caroline had been making calls, and the responses split exactly as I'd expected. My father's side of the family mostly defended my parents with messages like, "Family should forgive," and "You only get one set of parents," while my mother's side asked more questions, and several cousins admitted they'd noticed the difference in how my parents treated Emma versus Michael's kids. My cousin Jennifer, who I'd seen at maybe 5 family events total, sent a thoughtful email saying she'd observed the dynamic at Thanksgiving the previous year, when my parents had made a big fuss over Tyler's school project, but barely asked Emma about her honor roll achievement, and her witness testimony from someone with no stake in the conflict meant more to me than she probably knew. Then on a Thursday evening, I got a text from an unexpected source, a number I didn't have saved but that identified itself quickly. "Sarah, this is Jennifer, Michael's wife. I got your number from Caroline. I hope it's okay that I'm reaching out." I stared at the message for a long moment before responding that yes, it was okay, and she wrote back asking if we could meet for coffee that weekend, just the two of us, because there were things she wanted to say that she couldn't say in front of Michael. We met on Saturday morning at a coffee shop halfway between our neighborhoods, and Jennifer looked nervous when she sat down across from me, and she started with, "I need you to know that I've been uncomfortable with how your parents treat you and Emma for at least 2 years. I've brought it up to Michael multiple times, but he doesn't see it, or doesn't want to see it." She told me that my parents came to their house 3 or 4 times a week, that they'd given Michael $15,000 the previous year to help with a kitchen renovation, even though Michael and Jennifer's combined income was over $200,000 annually, that my mother frequently made comments about helping the family that needs it most, while simultaneously accepting my $700 weekly payments. Jennifer said, I didn't know you were paying them anything until Michael mentioned it during your confrontation, Sarah, and when he told me the amount I was horrified because they're also giving us money and free childcare, and I realized they were essentially taking from you to give to us. And I watched her eyes fill with tears as she said, I'm so sorry. I should have said something sooner. I should have pushed back harder when I noticed the favoritism. Jennifer's revelation stayed with me through the following week as I tried to process the full picture of my parents' financial manipulation, and I had just started to settle into my new normal of blocked numbers and deliberate distance when I received a formal invitation in the mail to my grandmother's 80th birthday party, a catered dinner at a nice restaurant that my Uncle David was hosting in 3 weeks. I stood in my kitchen holding the cream-colored cardstock and felt my stomach twist because I knew my parents would be there and they'd expect me to show up and act like nothing had happened, to smile and play happy family for grandmother's sake. But I also knew that my grandmother Ruth was sharp as a tack and had never been one to tolerate nonsense from anyone, including her own children. I called Aunt Caroline and asked if she thought I should attend, and she said firmly, Absolutely, you should come. Your grandmother has been asking about you and Emma, and you have just as much right to be there as anyone else. So I RSVP'd yes for both of us, and spent the next 3 weeks alternating between confidence and dread. The night of the party, I dressed Emma in her nicest dress, and myself in a navy blue outfit that made me feel put together and strong. And when we walked into the private dining room at Giovanni's, I saw my parents' faces register shock that I'd actually come, because my mother's expression flickered from surprise to forced pleasantness in the span of a second. My grandmother was holding court at the head of a long table, and her face lit up when she saw Emma, and she called out, There's my great-granddaughter! Come give Nana a hug! And I watched Emma run to her while my parents stood stiffly near the bar, pretending to be very interested in their drinks. The dinner started civilly enough with about 20 family members making small talk and toasting my grandmother, and I sat between Aunt Caroline and my cousin Jennifer with Emma on my other side, strategically positioned far from my parents who were seated near Michael and his family. We were halfway through the main course when my grandmother set down her fork and looked directly at me, and said in her clear voice that carried across the table, Sarah, dear, I haven't seen Emma in months. How is school going? And I felt every conversation pause as the table's attention shifted to us. I smiled at Emma and said, She's doing wonderful. She made honor roll again this semester and won an award in her science fair. And my grandmother beamed and said, That's my smart great-grandbaby. And where were you for her birthday last month? I expected to get pictures. And the question hung in the air like a challenge because my grandmother had a way of asking things that sounded innocent but carried weight. I saw my mother open her mouth to redirect the conversation, but something in me decided this was the moment, so I said calmly, Actually, Grandma, Mom and Dad weren't able to make Emma's birthday party. They had other plans. And my grandmother's eyes sharpened and she said, What other plans could possibly be more important than a great-grandchild's birthday? My mother said quickly, Now, Mother Ruth, it was just a scheduling conflict. But my grandmother made a dismissive sound and looked at me and said, Sarah, what really happened? And I felt everyone at the table watching and waiting. I took a breath and said quietly, The truth is that Mom and Dad have missed most of Emma's important events over the past 3 years. They consistently choose to spend time with Tyler and Mason instead. And when I tried to talk to them about the pattern, they told me I was being dramatic. And my Uncle David, who was sitting near my father, said uncomfortably, Sarah, maybe this isn't the time. But my grandmother cut him off with, No, David, let her speak. I asked a question, and I want the whole answer. I felt Aunt Caroline's hand squeeze mine under the table as I said to my grandmother, For the past 3 years I've been paying Mom and Dad $700 a week, which totals $109,200, and they told me it was to help with expenses while they provided childcare for Emma. But they've consistently chosen to spend their time with Michael's children instead, while still accepting my money. The silence that fell over the table was absolute, and I watched my grandmother's expression shift from curious to thunderous, as she turned to look at my father and said in a voice I'd only heard her use a handful of times in my life, "James, is this true?" And my father's face had gone pale while my mother said quickly, "Mother Ruth, you don't understand the full context. Sarah is exaggerating." But my grandmother held up one hand and said, "I asked James, not you, Linda." And my father opened his mouth and closed it twice before saying weakly, "We did help Sarah. We were there for Emma when she needed us." And I felt something fierce rise in my chest as I said, "You were there exactly 4 times in 3 years for my daughter's important events. I have a calendar documenting every school play, every recital, every birthday party, and you attended 4 out of 23 occasions while attending every single one of Tyler and Mason's events." My Uncle David said uncomfortably, "Sarah, maybe we should discuss this privately." But my grandmother's voice cut across his like a knife, and she said, "No, this family has done enough discussing things privately. Let's have it all out in the open." And she looked at my father with disappointment etched in every line of her face and said, "You became exactly what I hoped you wouldn't. You're doing to Sarah what your father did to Caroline." Michael finally spoke up and said, "Grandma, this is between Sarah and Mom and Dad. She's making it sound worse than it is. They help us because we have 2 kids and more expenses." But Jennifer set down her wine glass with enough force that it clinked against her plate and said, "Michael, stop. You know that's not true. Your parents gave us $15,000 last year while taking $700 a week from your sister who makes a third of what we make." I watched Michael's face flush red as he stared at his wife and said, "Jennifer, what are you doing?" And she said clearly, "I'm telling the truth, something this family apparently doesn't do enough of. I've watched your parents favor our children over Emma for 2 years, and I've told you it was wrong, and you've ignored me." Aunt Caroline spoke up then and said, "I've seen it too. At Thanksgiving last year, Ruth, you would have been appalled at how they fawned over Tyler's school project while barely acknowledging that Emma had made honor roll." And my cousin David's wife, Angela, added, "At the 4th of July picnic, they left Emma's softball game at halftime to go watch Mason's swimming lesson." I watched my parents sit frozen as family member after family member confirmed what I'd been experiencing, and my father finally said in a hoarse voice, "We didn't realize. We didn't mean to." But my mother's face had set into defensive lines and she said, "You're all ganging up on us. We love all our grandchildren equally." And my grandmother made a sound of disgust and said, "Linda, I have known you for 40 years, and I know when you're lying, and what I'm hearing tonight is that you have been taking money from a struggling single mother while giving money to your son who doesn't need it and favoring his children over hers." The dinner ended in uncomfortable silence after my grandmother told my parents she was disappointed in them and suggested they think long and hard about what kind of legacy they wanted to leave. And Emma and I left shortly after, with hugs from Aunt Caroline and a whispered, "I'm proud of you," from Jennifer, that made my eyes sting with unexpected tears. The next 3 days passed in radio silence from my parents, and I told myself I was fine with it, that I'd said what needed to be said, and whatever happened next was on them. But on the 4th day, my phone rang at 8 in the morning with my father's name on the caller ID, and I stared at it for 3 rings before answering. His voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it when he said, "Sarah, it's Dad. Is this a good time to talk?" And I said carefully, "Emma's at school, I have a few minutes." And I heard him take a shaky breath before he said, "I need to apologize to you, a real apology, not the defensive garbage I've been feeding you." I sat down on my couch and waited, and he continued, "Your grandmother called me the morning after her party, and she told me things about myself that were hard to hear. And then I couldn't sleep that night, so I went back through my calendar and my photos, and I counted how many times I've been there for Emma versus how many times I've been there for Tyler and Mason and Sarah. I was horrified by what I found." His voice cracked slightly and he said, "You were right about everything. I've been to 4 of Emma's events in 3 years, and I've been to every single one of your brother's kids' events, and there's no excuse for that. None at all. I felt tears building behind my eyes, but I kept my voice steady and said, "Why, Dad? Why did you do it?" And there was a long pause before he said, "I've been trying to figure that out, and the truth is, I've always favored Michael, ever since you were kids, and I don't have a good reason except that he's my son, and there was some kind of stupid traditional thinking in my head that sons matter more, that they carry on the family name or some outdated nonsense like that." He took another breath and said, "Your mother is still struggling to see it. She's defensive and hurt that the family witnessed what happened at the party, but I've been working on her because this isn't something we can sweep under the rug anymore." I said quietly, "You took $109,000 from me while I was struggling to make ends meet, and you gave Michael $15,000 that he didn't need." And my father said, "I know, and I want to make that right. I want to repay you in installments, 500 a month until the full amount is returned, and I know that will take years, but I want to do it." I wiped my eyes and said, "The money matters less than your behavior changing. I need to know that Emma won't be hurt anymore." And my father said with more conviction than I'd heard from him in years, "I want a chance to be a real grandfather to her. I want to prove to you that I can change, and I'm asking you to give me a trial period to show you I mean it." I thought about Emma's face when she talked about her grandparents, and I thought about my own need to protect her from more disappointment, and I said, "If you want to try, here are my terms. You show up when you commit to showing up. You treat Emma with the same attention and enthusiasm you show Tyler and Mason, and the first time you backslide or choose Michael's family over mine for something important, we're done permanently." My father said, "That's fair. That's more than fair." And then he asked, "Can I take Emma out this Saturday? Just the two of us? Maybe to that science museum she loves?" And I felt something cautious and fragile bloom in my chest as I said, "She would love that. But Dad, if you cancel on her, I will never forgive you." And he said, "I won't cancel. I promise you, Sarah. I won't let her down again." 3 months after my father's phone call, I stood at the back of Emma's elementary school auditorium, watching her receive the Principal's Award for Academic Excellence, and when I looked to my left, I saw my parents sitting 3 rows ahead, clapping enthusiastically, while my mother wiped her eyes. And when I looked to my right, I saw Lisa giving me a thumbs up with tears streaming down her face, because she knew what this moment meant. My father had kept his promise about the Science Museum that first Saturday, and he'd shown up at 9 in the morning exactly as he'd said he would, and I'd watched from the window as Emma climbed into his truck with cautious excitement on her face. And when they returned 4 hours later, she was chattering about the planetarium show and the dinosaur exhibit, and how Grandpa had bought her a book about stars that she carried everywhere for 2 weeks. The changes hadn't been perfect or linear, because my mother had missed Emma's soccer game in the second month, claiming she'd gotten the date wrong. But when I'd called my father that evening, his voice had been tight with anger as he told me he'd had a serious conversation with my mother about keeping her commitments. And the next week, both my parents had shown up to Emma's makeup game with apologetic expressions and a new soccer ball. The $500 checks arrived on the first of each month without fail, and I'd opened a college fund for Emma with the money because I wanted something good to come from those years of feeling invisible and undervalued, and the account now held $2,000 that would grow over the 18 years it would take my parents to repay their debt. My relationship with Michael remained strained and surface level because he still seemed to think I'd overreacted and made a private family matter inappropriately public. But Jennifer and I had developed an unexpected friendship that involved coffee every other week and honest conversations about family dynamics and boundaries. And she'd confided that she was working on Michael to recognize his own blind spots about privilege and favoritism. My mother's journey toward genuine acknowledgement had been slower and rockier than my father's, because she still occasionally made comments about how I was keeping score or holding grudges. But I'd learned to respond calmly by restating my boundaries and reminding her that consistent behavior was what mattered. And gradually I'd seen small shifts in her awareness, like when she'd recently told me she'd declined watching Tyler for an afternoon because she'd already committed to taking Emma shopping. I'd also noticed something fundamental had shifted in myself during these months because I no longer felt that desperate need for my parents' approval or validation that had driven so much of my behavior for 32 years, and I realized that my worth as a person and a mother had always been there independent of whether they recognized it. At work, I'd been talking more with Daniel, the systems analyst who worked 2 cubicles down from mine, and we'd gone to lunch 3 times in the past month, which Lisa insisted was the beginning of something, but I was taking it slowly because my priority was Emma and my own healing. As I watched Emma walk across that stage to shake the principal's hand while holding her certificate, I felt tears blur my vision because this moment was happening regardless of who showed up to witness it. Her achievement was real and valuable, whether my parents attended or not, but the fact that they were here and genuinely celebrating her made something tender and cautious bloom in my chest. After the ceremony, Emma ran to me first, with her arms outstretched, and I caught her and spun her around while she laughed and said, "Did you see, Mom? Did you see?" And I said, "I saw, baby. I'm so proud of you." And then my parents approached carefully, and my father said, "Congratulations, Emma, that was wonderful." And my mother handed her a card that I later learned contained a $50 savings bond. We all went to Emma's favorite pizza place afterward, and I sat between my daughter and my father while Lisa sat across from us next to my mother. And the conversation was sometimes awkward but mostly genuine, and I realized this was what the new equilibrium looked like: imperfect, careful, bounded by clear expectations, but real. I drove home that evening with Emma chattering in the back seat about her award and whether she could hang it in her room. And I thought about how far we'd come from that morning 3 months ago when she'd cried about her grandparents missing her birthday party. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years settle into my bones. Peace. Not the peace of perfect resolution or completely healed relationships, but the hard-won peace of knowing I'd stood up for my daughter and myself. The peace of boundaries that protected us. The peace of worth that didn't depend on anyone else's recognition. And as I pulled into our driveway and looked back at Emma's sleepy smile, I knew that whatever happened with my parents from here forward, we would be okay, because I'd finally learned that our value had been there all along.